Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest employment law webinar from the team at Harrington Carmichael. We're just getting everyone into the room, so in time-honoured fashion, I'll let that run for 30 seconds or so to make sure we've got maximum numbers in, and then we can start the session. Hope everyone's having a sunshiny day that we're having here in sunny Farnborough. No better way to celebrate the sunshine than listening to a webinar. Hopefully some of you are outside listening to it in the good weather. So I think, given the time and the numbers that we've already got loaded, let's start the session. As I say, welcome to the latest webinar from the employment team at Harrington Carmichael. In this webinar, we're looking at changes to sick pay coming into force in April 2026. My name's Matt Jenkin. I'm one of the partners in the employment team at Harrington Carmichael. I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Joe Boxall. Joe is a solicitor in the employment team. She regularly advises clients on sick pay and sickness absence. Whilst I'll be looking at the changes to sick pay, Joe's then going to look at managing sickness absence in light of the changes that are coming through. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. Timings, I would hope that we'll run through maybe till about 12:45, leaving some times for questions. If you do have questions, pop them into the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll try and deal with as many of those as we can at the end. And in terms of the material we're using today, you will be sent a copy of the slides following the webinar. You'll also be sent a copy of the recording. We are recording today's session, so if you're unable to join us for the whole of the session, you'll get that link and you can catch up at your leisure on the session. That sometimes takes a couple of days to come through, so do bear with us. If it's not kind of in your inbox this afternoon, don't worry, it's still on our to-do list and we'll make sure that that's sent out to you as soon as we can. Well, welcome everyone. And as I say, Harrington Carmichael, for those who don't know us, we're a full service law firm. And actually that I think is important when we look at the sort of entities and businesses that we act for. And they're all sizes, from startups through to large PLCs. And really, sick pay is an issue that, talking to my client base, I know is going to impact on all those clients across the whole of the kind of employment sphere. We'll also badge ourselves as relationship lawyers because we want to build relationships with our clients. And it's through those relationships really that we've picked up from our clients what are the real issues around sick pay and sickness absence that are really on their mind. And we're hoping that we're going to address those during this session. And as I say, if you've got any questions, please ask as we go through. Looking then at what we're going to cover in today's session, I'm going to look really at statutory sick pay, the changes to statutory sick pay, and also how statutory and contractual sick pay interact. And I do think there'll be more employers looking at the interaction between statutory sick pay and company sick pay on the back of these changes. Joe's then going to be talking to us about managing unauthorised absence and potential abuse of sick pay, and also terminating employment during sick pay periods. So it's a fairly packed session, and hopefully we'll give you plenty to think about. So if we look at statutory sick pay and we look at the changes that are being brought about by the Employment Rights Act. Now, I'm sure many of you on this call will know that the Employment Rights Act represents the biggest change to employment law in decades. I've been saying to clients, look, I was qualified 30 years last October, and I can't remember a single bigger change that's happened to employment law in one hit. Now, of course, when I say one hit, it's the case that various changes are being phased in 26 and 27, with the first round of those changes taking effect in April 2026. And those changes will include the changes to statutory sick pay that I'm going to focus on in my part of this session. Now, I think it's fair to say that other changes have grabbed the headlines. Of course, we've had unfair dismissal protection qualification being reduced from 2 years to 6 months, which really I think has been the focus of discussion around the Employment Rights Act. Also, increasingly, I think employers are starting to turn their attention to the changes in relation to sexual harassment and the impact of the new obligation from October 2026 to take all reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace, and also the reintroduction of protection against third-party harassment. However, I don't think that the impact of statutory sick pay reforms should be underestimated. And I think a number of employers are starting to also take that view. In fact, I'm sure some of you may have seen a very recent ACAS survey, and that saw employers identifying the statutory sick pay reforms as having the number one impact for employers, and that was over and above the unfair dismissal reforms. Now, whether that reflects the fact that statutory sick pay changes are going to come into force sooner than the unfair dismissal protection changes, I'm not sure, but I do think it shows the growing awareness from employers as to the impact of the statutory sick pay changes. And those changes really represent possibly, I think, the biggest shake-up to statutory sick pay since it was first introduced back in 1982, all that time ago. And we have seen some significant changes to that regime. For example, the changes to the end or the ability to, and ultimately the end of the recovery of statutory sick pay from HMRC, which I think stopped way back in 2014, if I recall correctly. But this series of changes certainly goes beyond that. So what are we looking at here? First of all, we're going to see from April 2026 the removal of the lower earnings limit. That currently sits at £125 per week. And that opens up, the removal of that opens a lower earnings limit, opens up SSP, as we'll see, to far more of the workforce than we see now. It will also mean the changes that all eligible employees will become entitled to statutory sick pay from the first day of absence. Again, statutory sick pay at the moment isn't payable for the first 3 qualifying days in any period of entitlement. So for very short-term absence, so 1 or 2 days, an employee may not actually qualify for any pay at all, and certainly won't qualify for statutory sick pay at that stage. And statutory sick pay will be the lower of 80% of the employee's earnings or the current flat statutory rate. And as of April 2026, that flat statutory rate is going to be £123.25 per week. And of course, that's the rate that goes up incrementally each April, but not by huge amounts. And also, I think it's worth emphasising, and a point that I do think has perhaps been overlooked, is that statutory sick pay will come to be enforced by the Fair Work Agency. There'll be a little bit of a lead in time. Fair Work Agency is being established from April 2026 and is really can be seen as the enforcement arm of the Employment Rights Act. And I think we'll vie perhaps with employment tribunals for how employment rights in the UK are enforced going forward. It's easy to overlook the Fair Work Agency and just see it as another government quango that will just, kind of subsume civil service resource without having a much impact for employers on a day-to-day basis. But I think that's wrong. The Fair Work Agency is going to have enhanced powers to inspect workplaces. They're going to be able to come in and look at your, for example, sick pay records. They're going to be able to issue penalty notices for underpayments, and those underpayments will include if an employer was underpaid statutory sick pay. And as well as looking to, with those notices of underpayments, requiring an employer to pay the workers the amount that's been underpaid, there'll also be an ability to order a penalty, effectively a fine, to be paid to the government for that underpayment. As I saw the last reiteration of the enforcement provisions, it looks like that could be up to 200% of the value of the underpayment. So huge potentially financial exposure for getting statutory sick pay wrong going forward. Fair Work Agency is going to be able to initiate court action, and they'll be able to represent workers in tribunals. And interestingly, they will be able to recover costs. The idea is that the Fair Work Agency will become self-funding, so it will pay for itself. And how will it pay for itself? By bringing enforcement action and recovering costs from employers of that enforcement action. So really, they will be encouraged, if they're to be a self-funding model, to bring claims against employers. So I don't think this should be seen as an organisation that will simply sit there in the background. It will definitely have enforcement teeth. But I think before we look at the impact of those changes, one important thing to highlight, because I was having a really interesting discussion with a HR manager the other day, was to make it clear that what isn't changing is any significant increase in the rate of SSP. That's going to sit, as I say, at £123.25 per week for the kind of financial year April 26 to 2027. There'll be a small increase then in the following year. But to put that in context, the average weekly earnings, according to the most recent ONS study survey, was £741 per week. That means that SSP is just 16.63%, if I've got my maths right. And there's a good chance I haven't, but I think I've got my maths right. And it only represents 16.63% of the average weekly earnings. So still a huge gap between what people earn and what statutory sick pay provides for. And whilst those changes do address a number of criticisms that have been made over a number of years about statutory sick pay, for example, low paid workers below the low earnings limit aren't eligible, it's not payable from day one, it doesn't address the level of pay. And I'm not sure if my good friend Steve Herbert is on this webinar, but if he is, he'll recall that we've spoken at seminars over a number of years where we've looked at the issue of sickness absence and the growing issue of sickness absence in the UK workforce. And one of the things that's been talked about at length is really a root and branch reform to how we deal with sickness absence, including far greater levels of statutory sick pay that would be payable. To put that in some context, each year around 1.2 million people in the UK experience a period of long-term sickness absence lasting 4 weeks or more. And out of that, 120,000 will leave their job early after 4 weeks absence or longer. So you can see the impact that sickness absence has on the UK workforce. You don't need me to tell all the delegates on this call the cost of recruitment and retention when you're losing employees who have sickness absence issues. So whether or not these changes will ultimately address that, I'm not so sure. We'll see our comments on some of that as we go through. So let's look at perhaps the impact of the changes and the numbers involved. The first stat is really taken from the government's own impact assessment. If you're really interested in the Employment Rights Act and you want a snapshot of what's going on, as well as checking out the Herons and Carmichael kind of landing page, and I'll make sure I put a link to that when we send out our slides and recording. Actually, the government have produced a series of fact sheets, which they do keep up to date, explaining a little bit of each of the changes and also talking about the impact the various changes under the Employment Rights Act will have. And they acknowledge in their impact assessment that an additional 1.3 million employees who currently earn below the lower earnings limit will now become eligible for SSP. So a huge number of employees who are currently disenfranchised from SSP will become eligible. And 25% of all employees from a survey that I was reading only get SSP. So there's going to be an earlier entitlement of payment for those employees. And we'll see with company sick pay that tends to be paid from a day one situation. And then again, taking the impact assessment, and I think the government is very clear and accepts that it will have an impact on business in terms of SSP costs, because you're not able to recover that from HMRC like we used to do back when that was permissible. And they're estimating only, I think, a 450 million annual additional cost to businesses. Now, that may well be the case, but when I see kind of 1.3 million employees becoming eligible for SSP who weren't and having to pay that earlier, that to me seems quite a low estimate as to the additional cost. And it'd be really interesting, I think, perhaps after the first year to assess what those additional costs have been. So I think from that, hopefully that gives you just the kind of highlight of the numbers, gives you an overview of the impact it's likely to have across all organisations. And if we look then at the impact, particularly for employees, as I've said, it will lead to earlier payment, no more waiting days, a broader coverage. So again, it's that idea that with the abolition of the lower earnings limit, so far as it applies to statutory sick pay qualification, we'll see say a larger number of employees being eligible for statutory sick pay than ever before. One of the things that I think the government hopes by these changes, it will start to see the end of presenteeism. And that's the idea that people are actually attending work when they're not well enough to attend work because simply they can't afford to take the time off to recover. And I'm sure we've all sat, haven't we, in workplaces where we've had colleagues coughing and spluttering, and before you know it, there's a bout of cold or flu that's gone round the business, with increased absence levels as a result. Now, I think that's a laudable kind of principle and something to aim for. But I think if we go back to my earlier comments on the level of statutory sick pay, when there's such a huge disconnect between what people actually earn and the level of statutory sick pay that people might receive, I'm not so sure that that's going to lead to a huge amount of kind of the end of presenteeism as it currently stands, because people, I think, will still feel under financial pressure to attend work when perhaps they're not well enough to do so. And what it will also mean is earlier phased returns to work. Because of the particular peculiarities of the statutory sick pay scheme, it actually has made, particularly for lower paid employees, phased returns to work more difficult, because you can find yourself no longer being eligible to statutory sick pay because of things like qualifying days and periods of incapacity for work. And what we're going to see, certainly with the changes that have made, I think it'll make easier for employers and employees to trial phased returns to work. And that to me, it is a huge benefit, because again, the research shows the quicker that you can get someone back into work after a period of sickness absence, the more likely they are to kind of stick, rather than having prolonged sickness absence. As I say, once people have been off for 4 weeks or more with a period of sickness absence, the chances of them leaving the workforce increase considerably. So I think earlier phase returns to work will help. What about employers? And I appreciate we kind of wear two hats, don't we? We're interested in this from our own perspective as employees, but what does it mean for employers? What does it mean for the organisations you work for? And what does it mean for your kind of administration of statutory sick pay? What does it mean for the client that we advised? Certainly and inevitably, I think an increased cost. As I say, I think 450 million per annum is perhaps a low ball from what I'm seeing in terms of the impact, but certainly it's going to be significant. That's a cost that employers will have to bear. Operational changes. What I mean by this is updates to payroll systems. Your systems will have to recognise that more people will become entitled to statutory sick pay. Contracts and policies will need to be updated and reviewed, and I'll touch on a kind of outline of playbook of how to deal with these changes towards the end of my session. But certainly we've already seen, and I know I've worked with Joe closely on a number of contract and handbook reviews recently, where we're starting to strip out all that old sort of language that we included around statutory sick pay, around it's not payable for the first 3 days of absence, these are your qualifying days, lots of things that we include in contracts and policies that just simply won't be relevant once these changes have come into force. Calculation shifts, so getting used to that idea that those employees who earn below the standard rate will still be entitled to 80% of their earnings. So we're going to have to work out what that will be. Won't surprise you to know, will it, from all of that, there's going to be increased administration for us. I can see more pressure put on organisations to keep better payroll records, particularly with the enforcement risks. You get an employee who's complained to the Fair Work Agency about underpayment of statutory sick pay. The Fair Work Agency may well knock on your door, they may well ask to come in, they may well ask to look at your sick pay records. And I think if they find there's been underpayments, then that's when I see, certainly potential financial penalties, as well as having to pay the employees the amount of that underpayment. So from my perspective, these changes are going to have a real significance for employers. And what will it be particular sector based? What do we think the sectors that will be most impacted? And I think when I look at it, I think certainly hospitality, retail, leisure, manufacturing, social care, and other low paid, irregular hours workers. Those are the ones, certainly from when I've been reading around the topic, I think would be most impacted. But I think the important thing is to say most impacted. I wouldn't want organisations to say in professional services to think that they won't be impacted as well, because I do think there'll be a knock-on effect, even if you are more generous than SSP and you're paying some portion of company sick pay, because I think that's going to be looked at as we go through. And why do I think those sectors in particular are most impacted? If you look at the kind of makeup of those sectors, some of those will have lower paid employees, so may have been below that lower earnings limit before, and therefore would not have been eligible for statutory sick pay at all. Perhaps within those sectors, a higher exposure to short-term intermittent absences. That's that, the Friday off, the Monday off, rather than long-term absence that we perhaps see in other sectors. And also, I think a greater operational disruption when staffing dips unexpectedly. Now, I know there's always disruption when staffing dips unexpectedly. And, if there's someone from an accountant's firm on this session, then I know the headache that can be caused when you're doing audits and things like that, to suddenly have someone who's off sick. But if you're thinking you're running quite a tight ship on, say, a restaurant where your staffing levels are really down to the max, the minimum limits, given all the other cost pressures that you're operating under, all it takes is one member of staff, isn't it, to go off sick, and you're then going to have a greater impact on operationals, on operational aspects of the business. So I think that's why I think those sectors are going to be suffer a bigger impact than perhaps some. And that really then leads on, I think, to the next question, because and I probably get accused of being too cynical as an employment lawyer, so I apologise for this. But the question that I think lots of people are asking, it's a question that comes up when we debate it amongst our team, when we talk to our clients about, well, what do we think the fallout from the Employment Rights Act is going to be? Is, do I think it will lead to an increase in sickness absence? Well, the answer is probably. I don't think there's any getting away from that. If we do the calculation, more eligible employees plus payments starting on day one equal a lower financial disincentive to be absent. So I think more people will take up sickness absence as a result. Certainly when you look at industry bodies, and I appreciate there may be a slight bias amongst some of the industry bodies over the impact of the changes to statutory sick pay, but certainly they're anticipating an increase in sickness absence as a result. And actually, if you look at the government policy intent and that idea that it's there to reduce presenteeism, and looking at the fact sheet, it's pretty clear where the government's coming from on this, because they say, and I think this is a really good way of kind of summing up what they think the impact of the changes will be, is that the changes will support all employees to take the time off they need to recover by producing better financial security, whilst also limiting the costs to businesses and reducing the spread of infectious diseases. So clearly there's an element there, isn't there? Quite clearly the government wants to reduce that presenteeism aspect. So I'm a bit more cynical than that, because I think until you get a kind of greater parity between what people are actually paid and the statutory sick pay rate, I'm not sure that if you're if you are in a low paid bracket, that you're going to suddenly take statutory sick pay in circumstances where where genuinely you're not ill, or in circumstances perhaps where you wouldn't have taken it before, simply because you can't afford to take sickness absence at that stage. But I'm not anticipating that we're going to see a root and branch reform of statutory sick pay, certainly. I think this is as far as it's going to go. There are some interesting research papers out there and government papers which are trying to encourage, I think, employers to take more proactive measures to manage sickness absence in the workplace. But that's not going to be government funded. Some of you may remember what we used to refer to as kind of the government light kind of state sponsored sickness absence management and occupational health, giving employers access to that, which kind of, died on the vine, frankly, due to lack of funding. It was a good idea. It was just inadequately funded, as I think most people kind of flagged at the time it was introduced. So I think these are the extent of the sickness absence changes that we're going to see for the time being. Still significant though, and something that we need to adjust to. So I'm sure many of you have already started to look at SSP. April is not too far away, as we already know. So how can you prepare for the changes to SSP? If you haven't already done so, or you're working your way through that, what are some of the things that we think you need to do? Certainly review your employment contracts and policies for those outdated SSP references. We need to make sure that those are, we're getting rid of the references to 3 waiting days and things like that. That's just not going to be applicable as we go through. Make sure your record keeping is up to date. Not only will I think that help if you have any issues around absence management, but also it'll help where you've got kind of the Employment Rights Agency looking at enforcement. Train managers on dealing with absence. I'm sure Joe's going to mention this in her session, but I think when you pick up at identifying problems with sickness absence, I think you're going to want to train your managers better on that. And again, part of that would be revisiting your sickness absence processes to ensure they're robust. And I certainly don't want to steal Joe's thunder on that, but I flagged that up as something certainly to look at. If you're looking at where to spend training budget this year, I appreciate budgets are tight for people. I think some training online managers on sickness absence management would be really well received, as well as a plug for some of the other changes that you might want to look at, probationary periods as well, with the unfair dismissal changes coming in. But I think that's where I would be concentrating, I think, my line manager training budget at this stage. So with SSP, I think it's also led, and I've had a number of conversations with clients around company sick pay, because I think inevitably when you're looking at statutory sick pay, the issue of company sick pay comes up. And I was drafting a contract for a new entrant into the UK employment sphere. So they were an overseas business who wanted to set up in the UK, and they were asking me what my experience was of how much do companies in the UK pay around company sick pay. And when I was researching it, it's really interesting, because certainly compared with statutory sick pay, there isn't that much empirical research on company sick pay and what rates are paying. But what we know from the research that's out there is that there's still a significant minority of UK employers who offer more than statutory sick pay. So 43% of employers offer company sick pay. So that's something over and above statutory sick pay, at least for the first 2 weeks of sickness absence. Whereas 16% of businesses switch to SSP only after 4 days of absence. So they won't necessarily be hit by the changes around the removal of the waiting days, but they might be hit by the changes to the lower earnings limit. What's really interesting, high earners are more likely to benefit from enhanced sick pay. 90% of those earning over £50,000 have some form of company sick pay as a top up to statutory sick pay, comparing those at the lower earnings limit. Perhaps not hugely surprising when we look at our own contracts in relation to that, as to how company sick pay is managed. But I do think it's interesting, certainly, that company sick pay is still paid, but it's kind of not particularly well documented as to the levels. And I say, going back to the client who asked me around what did I think they should pay, what was I seeing, it was really trying to base it on other clients. And I think we were looking at maybe a 4 to 8 week company sick pay provision, given the particular sector they were in and given our knowledge of kind of that sector and who we work with. So it's a steer, but I don't think it'd be really interesting to get a bit more research done on the extent of company sick pay and the levels. Now, there is a relationship, as I say, between SSP and company sick pay, because, of course, any contractual remuneration goes towards discharging an employee's SSP liability. And often you'll write into your contracts, won't you, that company sick pay includes any SSP due. We want to avoid the risk, don't we, that an employee is going to come along and say, well, I get my company sick pay, but I get my SSP on top of that. Well, strictly speaking, that's the legal position anyway. You don't need to write that into your contracts of employment to make that clear. However, as a belt and braces employment lawyer, I think it can be useful to make that point. Although I haven't had any clients ring me up recently saying that an employee is trying to get kind of one of my clients' lovely phrases, double bubble when it comes to SSP. But if your contracts don't have that in, it can be something useful to look at. So, and I do think we're coming under more pressure to look at company sick pay. I think just generally looking at sick pay generally, I think employers are starting to look at that. And there are some tricky issues around company sick pay. So I think if you are one of those organisations that does provide for company sick pay, you will get those tricky issues. The first one I think I always come across is discretionary company sick pay. So, you have a clause in your contract that says, well, anything over and above SSP is paid at our discretion. But of course, discretionary benefits generally can lead to an implied contractual right in this place to company sick pay. And that's implied by custom and practice. Is something so notorious and certain, to quote some rather outdated court language, but notorious and certain to actually form part of your contracts of employment because it's implied by custom and practice. So if you look at your employee base and you always pay, for example, 2 weeks company sick pay, and then suddenly you want to turn around and say, well, it's discretionary, we're going to withdraw that, you're going to run into this implied right to contractual sick pay. And withholding company sick pay can often bring issues. And where I see this come up the most is where there's a dispute over whether someone's genuinely ill or not, and whether you can withhold company sick pay in those circumstances. I think that can be difficult, often very dependent on the wording in your contracts. But often what you're having to do is, if you're going to challenge an employee and they've produced a fit note from their GP that says they're unfit to work, if you don't believe them and you're going to stop paying company sick pay, you're going to have some other form of evidence rather than a hunch that they may not be ill. You're probably going to have to look at your own medical reports to challenge that. Can be very difficult, and if you get it wrong, it can expose you to those breach of contract claims and constructive unfair dismissal claims. Even when you have discretionary sick pay, terminating that discretionary sick pay itself can be difficult. If you think perhaps more on long-term sickness absence here, where you've had someone who's perhaps been off for 12 weeks, you've extended discretionary sick pay to them across that period, but kind of you need to bring that to an end because of the cost pressures that brings. Are you just going to withdraw that unilaterally from the employee, even though discretionary says that you can? Or are you going to have to give some lead-in time for reduction of that? And I always think it's a good idea to kind of build that into communication with employees so it doesn't kind of come as a cliff edge to them. So perhaps, part way through that company sick pay period, you're reminding them that their company sick pay will come to an end. Obviously, they may still get SSP, but say, as we've seen, that's going to lead to a drop off in salary for many employees. And I think by doing that, you reduce the argument that by just taking it away without any sort of notice is a breach of that implied duty of good faith. So do look at how the communication that you operate when you're removing company sick pay. And then the next issue that I think is always a tricky one is when we're talking about exercising discretion to extend sick pay is disability discrimination. And often what we see is an employee or their advisor arguing that it's a reasonable adjustment to continue to pay full pay during sickness absence when someone is disabled for the purpose of the Equality Act. And if you don't, that's a failure to make a reasonable adjustment and can expose you as an organisation to a claim in the Employment Tribunal for disability discrimination, failure to make reasonable adjustments. Now, I've listed 2 cases here. The Nottinghamshire County Council is the older of those 2 cases, I think, with O'Hanlon being, when I say the more recent, they're not particularly recent cases. If you read them side by side, you would think they would be contradictory because one says it is a reasonable adjustment and the later one in O'Hanlon says it isn't. However, I think it's fairly established now as to the state of the law. I think it's very difficult for a disabled employee to argue that they should receive full pay during sick leave once any contractual entitlement to full pay has been exhausted, unless the employer has caused the absence by failing to make reasonable adjustments which would have enabled the employee to remain at work. So it is an interesting question you have to ask yourself if someone is clearly disabled within the meaning of the Equality Act, is do we have to extend our sick pay? And if we don't, are we going to be exposed to a reasonable adjustments claim. I think those claims are difficult. I do see them being brought by employees. But as I say, I think the case law is on side with the employer stopping company sick pay. But certainly, I think it's one that's worth considering. And then the other question often we get asked, dismissal whilst in receipt of contractual sick pay or even statutory sick pay. How far do you have to wait in terms of dismissing them? You know, if someone's clearly unwell and unlikely to return, do you have to wait until the end of the SSP period before you dismiss them? Now, the answer to that is no, you don't, but you better make sure that you follow a fair process. And that's a lovely segue. You think we'd almost planned it into Joe's session, really on some of the practical applications of dealing with sickness absence. So Joe, over to you for a look at kind of some of those more practical aspects.
What a flawless handover. So as Matt said, employers don't have to wait until the end to dismiss the employee, but you need to be aware of those potential claims that we've discussed. So breach of implied terms, constructive unfair dismissal, and or disability discrimination as well. So to mitigate these risks, employers should consider one of my favourite phrases, building layers of protection around them. So dealing with it at the immediate time, holding discussions with employees about the reason for the absence, even if it is just a single absence, which we might see being more common following the introduction of statutory sick pay from day one, and also providing support where it's appropriate to do so. It also allows employers to address concerns before they escalate, so nipping it in the bud if we do think there is a reason why a particular employee is taking sick leave, perhaps when they shouldn't. I'm sure there's an employee that all springs to your mind when I say that. So in line with the reforms, there is an emphasis on proactive employer engagement. So what we should do in terms of those layers of protection is make effective use of occupational health referrals if those are appropriate, scheduling regular welfare meetings, and developing clear return to work plans for employees whose health issues require that ongoing support. So as Matt said, we also need to consider things like reasonable adjustments. That includes perhaps sick pay, often not, but other things like alternative duties whilst they return during their phase time, or perhaps even alternative roles, but we'll go into that more on the next slide. So as we said, potentially it would be a good idea to use some of your training budget towards training managers to deal with sickness absence and what to do in terms of discussing it with that employee. So employers should only ask lawful and proportionate questions to focus on their understanding about fitness to work, avoid any sort of intrusion into irrelevant medical detail. Ideally, what we're trying to avoid here is harassment. We would always recommend, but particularly in light of the changes, that employers maintain thorough documentation about the process and throughout the sickness absence. So, for example, including meeting notes, any occupational health advice, so that if later down the line we make a decision to dismiss, those decisions are clearly evidence-based and it assists you, like we say, with those layers of protection moving forward. So by adopting a proactive approach to sickness absence and tightening up procedures, which you will now be doing as a result of this webinar, you will in turn then deter the misuse of any new day one SSP entitlement. So I'm then going to cover what we do, well, what an employer would do if they want to dismiss an employee during long-term sickness absence. So you can terminate employment during that time. It's typically on capability grounds, but we need to be careful and consider the position before we do that. So I've included a list on the slide of, well, a non-exhaustive list of steps an employer can take to protect itself in the event of a potential claim, such as the ones we discussed. So starting point is typically gathering up-to-date, reliable medical evidence. So fit notes, making sure that they are kept up to date. You have all of them and we are aware of what they are saying. Occupational health reports, they're really helpful. They might not always be appropriate, but they certainly give a view as to whether somebody is disabled. Now, you or I can't decide that, and nor can occupational health. That's something that's a legal question ultimately, but it helps give us a steer on that medical condition, and also quite often assists in identifying potential reasonable adjustments that perhaps you or the employee haven't already thought of. So as we said, those potential adjustments might be about altering duties, perhaps working from home, perhaps even considering alternative roles within the business as well for a period of time or for the longevity. Now, you don't have to make a role, I should stress, but again, we should be considering all the possible alternatives. So, as we said, we can't decide whether somebody has a disability, but it's helpful to have some idea about that. As you already probably know, a disability is a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on a person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. Essentially, that means it's got to be something that affects them doing any normal part of their life, and it has lasted or is likely to at least last for 12 months. None of this rolls off the tongue, but it is obviously something very important that we need to consider. So, one of the other steps I would suggest is keeping in touch regularly with employees on sick leave, not to pressure them, but to just check in on them, offer support, and review expectations. For example, like Matt said, are we coming to the end of any sort of sick pay provisions? Any welfare meetings with the employee should be held at reasonable intervals, giving the employee advance notice of that as well, and the opportunity to be accompanied if, for example, that meeting could result in formal warning or dismissal. Even if dismissal is not contemplated, it's a good idea generally. It could be, for example, a potential reasonable adjustment for those who have a disability. Many employers also have EAP to refer an employee to, which might be particularly helpful in cases where sickness absence is because of mental health. If an employer is then considering moving to dismissal, I would strongly suggest you document every meeting, including what support has been discussed, what updates were provided on the employee's health, and what follow-up actions were then agreed. This is important because employers will need to show that they have genuinely weighed up the personal circumstances against the organisation's operational needs. That needs to be explained to the employee, so they need to understand the business impact of their ongoing absence. Again, we need to make sure all possible alternatives have then been explored as well, including redeployment, temporary changes, etc. We only consider dismissal where a return to work is unlikely within a reasonable period. As you know, lawyers love the word reasonable because we don't have any definition of that. So if the employee, for example, can't carry out their role even with reasonable adjustments, that's when a decision to dismiss might be made. If the decision is made to dismiss, the employer should provide a written confirmation setting out the reasons for dismissal. As Matt said, the right to bring an unfair dismissal claim is being reduced to 6 months. That also is aligned with a written statement of reasons for dismissal. So the employee would want to know, why have I been dismissed? It should also set out sort of notice and a right of appeal for that decision as well. If an appeal is requested, it needs to be handled by ideally a senior person and an impartial reviewer who needs to take into account any additional information the employee provides. As I said, you can dismiss an employee on long-term sickness absence for capability, so this might be a great time for you also to look at your capability procedures, so making sure they're aligned with the upcoming changes and ensuring we have the effective management of sickness absence. I'm now going to talk about dismissing somebody on short-term sickness absence. So as we said, it's likely and probably likely that we'll see an increase to short-term absences because now we get SSP from day one. The risk generally is lower, but there is obviously still some exposure. So as we said, at the moment, employees need 2 years qualifying service not to be unfairly dismissed. That will be reduced down to 6 months. But it could therefore increase the likelihood of potential claims, including if you were dismissed following a period of sickness absences. Disability discrimination, Matt's already touched on, doesn't require any qualifying period, as I'm sure many of you know. So that's always a potential claim that an employee might have regardless of their length of service. Again, although we can dismiss for short-term absences, we need to look at the underlying reason for them. before considering that dismissal. So does it relate, for example, to caring responsibilities? Is it because of a potential disability? Is it because of religious observance or other protected characteristics? We need to be sure about what's the issue or why the absence is occurring before then going to further steps. So in terms of sort of managing short-term absence, it's broadly similar to what we do for long-term. So if we think that there might be a disability, medical evidence should be obtained, and a referral to occupational health might also be appropriate. If an employer has actual or constructive knowledge of a disability, that duty to make reasonable adjustments is triggered. So if there is a slight possibility of an illness being a disability, be aware that that duty to make reasonable adjustments will be triggered from that point, because constructive knowledge can also be captured there. Employers should also assess whether short-term health issues affect the employee's ability to perform their role and consider changes such as redeployment, even in those sort of short absences, as we discussed. Another potential claim that we haven't spoken about is discrimination arising from disability. So this is a claim that might occur where an employee is treated unfavourably, including a dismissal, because of something resulting from their disability, such as a short-term sickness absence. Now, we can defend this form of discrimination if we can show that the unfavourable treatment was a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. It's not something ultimately we want to have a fight about. So again, we're making sure we're following a fair procedure when it comes to considering dismissal, even for short-term absences, and making sure we have all that relevant information and documented information that we protect the employer in case of a potential claim. I've then covered all of my parts that I wanted to. What we're going to do now is open the Q&A for some questions, or even the chat. I think there is a question already from Jennifer in the chat. So Matt and I will give you a few minutes just to pop in your questions, and then we'll deal with each of those as they come in.
Yeah, so I think the first one, and thank you for the question, it's a great question, is how about if your company offers 5 years income protection? And I think what we're talking about is those kind of insurance-backed schemes where an employer, after a period of sickness absence, often 26 weeks, the insurance policy pays the employee a percentage of their salary whilst their sickness absence continues. Sometimes that's capped at 3 years, 5 years, or it could be for the lifetime of employment. And it's a great question because it can impact on your ability to terminate an employee's employment for long-term absence, because if you terminate their employment, they will no longer be eligible for that benefit, because normally one of the conditions relating for eligibility is that they are an employee, and if you dismiss them, they'll no longer be an employee. And that can expose an employer to a breach of contract claim, a breach of an implied contract term, in that the implied term is that you won't dismiss an employee in circumstances where they would no longer be eligible for that payment. Now, there's ways that you can deal with that, and you obviously have to factor that in, because if you were in that position, you wouldn't then be looking at dismissing, although often on long-term sickness absence, my experience is the group income protection, the PHI provider, will look to try and manage that process as well. But you can actually include some clauses in your contract of employment which deal with that implied term by making it an express term of your contract that you can terminate their employment, even if that has an impact on their ability to claim under the group income protection scheme. So often what I'll be saying is if I see in an employment contract that an employer is offering group income protection or PHI, I would then be looking to make sure I include those kind of magic words in the sickness absence provisions in the contract to make sure that you can terminate. Because if you get it wrong, it's an expensive claim, because you could end up as the damages for the breach of contract would be the amount that the employee would be entitled to receive under the terms of that policy. So, for example, in the case in question of 5 years, if you dismiss them after a year, that's another 4 years salary, probably at 75% of their salary. If it's a lifetime benefit, then potentially until their retirement age would have been. So it is important, I think, if you do offer PHI, that in making sure you've got the right provisions in your contract to deal with dismissal.
Mm.
I hope that helps.
I was going to say that all arose from a case of Aston, where the implied term was then incorporated. But as you said, an express term helps deal with that. So we can help look at your contracts, make sure that that Aston clause is in there, and we're covered off all bases.
Yeah, and I think that the next question, I think we've got a couple of questions come through. ACAS references SSP being paid from day one for workers. Is that only applicable to employees and not to casual workers? I'm going to give a typical lawyer's answer here. It depends on the type of working arrangement that you have, and who it applies to. I'm just looking quickly at the sick pay guidance, because it can actually include some workers. In some cases, workers can be eligible for SSP. Because employee includes all those whose earnings are liable for Class 1 national insurance contributions. And therefore, if you've got a worker who's liable for those Class 1 national insurance contributions, they'd be eligible for SSP as well. I appreciate that's not necessarily a straightforward explanation, but it can actually apply to some workers as well. You'd have to look at the precise relationship to make that determination, but don't rule it out just because someone's got a worker label. And I think we've also got a question through. We've someone who's been given advice that a tribunal would assess whether we waited for SSP to run out before proceeding with a medical capability dismissal, as it's a statutory right. Do you also have to wait until the end of the 28-week period to achieve a safe dismissal? I don't think you do. I think if it was obvious that they weren't going to come back, you wouldn't necessarily have to wait. I think actually it's a good point to make, that it's probably the optics of that you would have to look at. I think the earlier that you dismiss within that statutory sick pay period, the more eyebrows will get raised by an employment tribunal. I don't know, Joe, have you got a thought on that?
No, I agree. I think, like we said before, it's thinking about the whole picture before moving to decide about any sort of dismissal, for example.
Yeah, I think it is looking at that in the round.
It is. It's holistic.
Yeah, and then for casual, then we've got one for casual staff who don't work regular hours. How do we calculate the loss of earnings if, for example, on a 6 p.m. finish shift, they phone in sick for that shift? Well, I think you'd have to then look at the particular calculations for, okay, how do you calculate 80% of their earnings in those circumstances? And again, I'm just looking at the regulations to see if it can give me any guidance. But I think that to answer that question, I think I might have to take a deeper dive into the regulations in terms of the calculation of SSP for those circumstances. But I know it can be difficult to calculate during that particular period. So what I may well do in those circumstances is when we respond with our update on that, I'll just drop perhaps a quick line in to deal with the actual calculation in those circumstances, if that would be helpful.
I was going to say, the next slide actually has our contact details as well. So if you didn't want to ask a question on the chat, or if you think of something after, please feel free to link with us on LinkedIn, send us a message. That we'd love that. Our QR codes are up on the slides. Hopefully it's just a case of holding your phone near to it and it should pick us up.
And then I think Joe will, in a minute, will scroll on to kind of the for those of you who aren't registered with us in terms of our employment sort of distribution list, where you get the invites to all the webinars and regular updates and things like that. So, but I appreciate probably a lot of you are, because I think a lot of you will have registered because you've received our updates anyway. But if you're not, Joe, if you want to share the details again, people can just link to us from there. Again, everything will be on the slides when we send them through, and we'll send the recording. And I think, looking at it, I'll just double check, jump back to the Q&A to see if there's been any more.
I know, I think for both of us, we need it in one place moving forward, don't we?
Yeah. I think that probably deals with all the questions, Joe. Well, brings us in just under the hour, but I'm sure people will be grateful to get an extra 5 minutes back on their day and go and enjoy the sunshine. So hopefully you found that interesting. As I say, if there's particular queries you've got, do follow up with me and Joe direct. We're happy to help with those. As I say, keep an eye out for the slides and the material and the recording when they come through. And it just leaves us to say, have a great rest of the day. Thank you.